And check this out. This is a stunning pre-Roman Italian bronze chariot. It's Etruscan, and now, does this look like the kind of thing that you plow the fields with? No. Do you haul your goods to market with this? No. This is a very expensive, very ostentatious prestige item. And these were prestigious objects used by prestigious people pretty much since the dawn of civilization, going back to Mesopotamia and 3000 BC or BCE, where monuments included depictions of chariots in battle parades. And yes, the chariot, was a war vehicle, an instrument of war, for thousands of years and across much of the world. From the Near East to the Far East, here's a depiction of a Chinese war chariot, Asia, Africa, Europe. By the 5th century BC, they were being used all the way up in the British Isles by the Celts. So they're a very workmanlike object within armies, but what happened early on, as our Mesopotamian note indicated, is that these became associated with victory. They became a symbol of victory and triumph. For instance, and probably very influentially, here's a depiction of what an Egyptian military chariot might have looked like in use. But notice the transition from rank-and-file soldiers to a pharaoh, right? A god king. Here is, I believe, Ramses II portrayed on one, so it's a symbol of the highest levels. And I mentioned influential when it comes to the Egyptian side of things earlier, because, this society spread its influence throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. It flourished long, long before Greece and Rome. And so very close to those two civilizations that I just mentioned, you had this kind of precedent. And so let's move on to the Greco-Roman world and remind ourselves with this relief sculpture here that Apollo, one of the most illustrious gods, was imagined to ride a chariot in the sky pulling the sun across it each day. So you can see the prestige factor of the chariot. It can be associated with anyone from a king / god king to an outright god. No surprise then that Roman emperors, like Marcus Aurelius here, were portrayed riding chariots. And this, of course, leads us to the famous Roman triumph. The ultimate honor in the Roman world to receive a triumphal parade where you are taken down the street to much fanfare, riding in a, well, you know what. And it's important to understand, even this far back into history, the chariot was already pretty much retired as an instrument of war. It began to be supplanted by straight-up cavalry at around the time of Alexander the Great, who of course preceded the Roman emperors by quite a bit. But this visual aspect of the symbol was still in full bloom and was not going to go anywhere anytime soon. It was a big player in medieval / Renaissance art, and of course that's around the time that tarot was created. But we can't skip up there yet. We have to stay with the Roman Empire to add yet another factor in the chariot's symbolic importance. We are looking at the Circus Maximus, the Circo Massimo. I've walked around down there, but here's what it might have looked like at its height when it was used for different occasions, but especially chariot races. These races were insanely popular, so it's important to understand that the chariot was kind of the apex of cool vehicle of its day. The men who won races in them were rock stars. I've seen this tidbit before. Some say the highest paid athlete of all time was a Roman charioteer. This source, for whatever it's worth, says that he would have been worth $15 billion today. That's just because of his earnings as a chariot racer. As this other source states, we know exactly how much this charioteer earned over his career. More than 35 million sesterces. Or sesterces, I have no idea, but you get the point. And that's why chariots looked something like this, or like these other ones that I'm going to show you. Right? These were not boring items to look at. These were, again, the Formula One cars of their day, imagining that Formula One was the most popular sport in the world, that is. And of course we've got to show at least one still from Ben-Hur, so there it is. All of this then would have been on the mind of the tarot's creator and the tarot's consumers in the early 15th century. The chariot denotes victory, military victory, sporting victory, cultural victory, and then even what would later be called coolness. celebrity via the racing angle. There's just something about the person, although it's a patriarchal world, so back then the man and his fast vehicle. That dynamic lasted well into the 20th century, like with Steve McQueen. That trope, I think we can say, is pretty much gone now. The world has changed a lot, but it lasted for a very long time. Here's some shots from the movie Grease, and who else would relate Grease to tarot? But it's part of this exact same cultural trope that I'm talking about that lasted millennia. The big action piece of that movie musical was a race, as seen here. And then in the final scene, what is the, in the eyes of the audience at the time, inexpressibly cool character? What does he ride away with in his girl? Well, of course, in a car. Han Solo might be the most famous of the last versions of this template, right? What was he so proud of about the Millennium Falcon? Its speed. And now let's look at the Chariot card from the start of tarot. We have a ruler holding the accoutrements of the time, the artistic accoutrements of leadership and power, being pulled along by two winged horses. Using a Pegasus instead of just a horse, or instead of just horses, adds that divine aspect from Apollo and the God Kings. So millennia after the start of the Chariot as an important symbol in the human consciousness, you get the tarot version, and early on, as we can see, it has this melding of the earthly and the divine, thereby, accidentally or not, mirroring Chariot aspects from thousands of years before, like with God Kings. So here's the Marseille Pattern, my favorite, Jodorowsky's tarot. I love how the faces on the shoulder plates are not identical, they have different expressions, as do the horses below. And no, the arrangement of the wheels does not make any sense. Well, ancient art didn't always get it right in terms of realism. Then again, neither did modern art, and of course that's not the point necessarily with tarot. So here you see a side-by-side comparison of the Marseille Pattern on the left, and of course the Rider-Waite-Smith Chariot on the right. That being the quintessential modern example. Modern in that it was, 20th century. A black sphinx and a white sphinx instead of two horses. I probably classify that under trying too hard. I prefer the older style where simplicity adds mystery, as opposed to the, just to me, overly consciously esoteric symbolism. This being the influential Oswald Wirth Tarot from the late 19th century, just as modern occult tarot was really starting to pick up steam. So it's no surprise to see overt symbols from Egyptology, Masonry, astronomy, you name it. You take the esoteric school of thought and something is going to be crammed into it during kind of the modern resurgence of tarot. Speaking of that, kind of the grandfather of that movement, Eliphas Levi, made this card, or I should say this card is based on his description of his design, and we can see that's where the Sphinxes got their start. That was from the mid-19th century, so skip up about half a century, and you get to the Rider-Waite-Smith as well as something like this. There's Aleister Crowley's Chariot, even busier and stranger than the Rider-Waite-Smith, but I do like the overall effect, I have to admit. Our armored figure is interesting, certainly takes away that personal glory aspect, at least in terms of seeing the face of the victorious champion or the ruler. So we'll go way back a few centuries to remind us that that was a big part of the formula early on. As seen here and here, a card that takes us all the way back to the beginning, see how similar it looks to the Visconti card we saw earlier. Both of them, of course, being from the early 15th century. Let's finish up by just quickly surveying some random postmodern interpretations. And just think about all the different aspects, at least from the original iconography, that have survived, even with something as out there, and I don't mean that as a criticism, as out there as this. Or as of the moment as this. You still have a central figure being drawn, a symbol of leadership, victory, glory. Here's Freddie Mercury, so pretty awesome, with two cats, a rainbow, the moon. Yeah, you've gotta love this version. Notice he's riding a motorcycle. That's the same thing you're going to see in the final two images, and I love that these artists are some of the few who pick up on this ancient hot rod kind of a thing that I was talking about earlier. Definitely a part of the Chariot's makeup as a symbol. Now, as you saw the big stately ones that are, kind of slowly drawing a seated ruler, Well, in a card like that draws from more of the Renaissance procession, going all the way back to Roman times procession tradition, well, that's not at the fore then, but it is part of the original and long-standing chariot visual meaning, if you will. I mean, a meaning that had thousands of years baked into it. So just wanted to focus on that a little bit because it's fun and forgotten, but it's just in the mix along with everything else we've talked about, the earthly power and success, divine slash celestial connotations in contrast. In closing, it's worth remembering how metaphorically potent the symbol of the chariot has been throughout almost all of human history, and it is the basis of the 7th Major Arcana Tarot card. Thanks.